Tonight we're going to be discussing studies, and I really did struggle at what to really call to summarize to summarize what I'm talking about in a topic, because it is accurate that it is studies. I wanted to, so this came up actually coincidentally recently when talking to somebody just about the certain levels that people go through in terms of their artistic process, on how far people go in terms of reaching the means of what they're after to attain. And it varies throughout art history, but there's a few notable people who I want to talk about this evening, and there's one especially notable painting that has a little bit of a mild attachment to Boston. But studies are, everybody that attends the school is very familiar with studies. So this is a selection of student and instructor demo work of the studies that we do here. And here you can see the full array of what we do. So we have a grisaille cast painting on the far right. We have casts of varying palettes from full to limited, and then we have a figure. So when we ask students to do a study, normally we ask them to do just one, and it usually focuses on the greater light effect and some of the pictorial concerns such as cropping and things like that. But we really only ask students to do one, but you wouldn't know what to ask, see the reaction sometimes, just saying. But also your cartoon is also a study as well. It is just as equal. So to me, there's not really a difference in my mind between a value and the color study and that of a drawing. They're both doing the same thing. They're informing you about a characteristic of your model. The cartoon deals with the proportion and the shaping. And in these color studies, what we typically ask of students is to observe the effects of light on form. So in this, we ask this of all students, even up into the. I probably should have asked if people didn't mind if I used their work, but anyway, sorry. Yeah. So no, I honestly, I'm not doing this this is not a sneak attack to put anybody into the spotlight, because I don't like that either. But so this is by John, one of our instructors here, and this is his first still life assignment, and this is his study on the right. And so you can see again, studying the overall pictorial effect. John had put a lot of thought and work and careful consideration into the shapes and the composition. So this was a study not just of satisfying the requirements that we typically ask, but this was going above and beyond, kind of zooming out, if you will, to see the greater meaning and how to experiment with that pictorial effect. So, Emmy as well is also using a method of study, so we kind of practice what we preach in terms of actually using studying to varying degrees. So this is also Julie doing a demonstration of a color study. And again, this is really just to emphasize the points where the drawing or the accuracy, the blending is really not the focus, but it is really to study the building blocks that you'll be using in order to create your overall image. Now, when I was talking about my composition lecture, I had talked about this painting by Alma Tadema of Antony and Cleopatra meeting. And I had talked about how he had gone through several different backgrounds before he had rested on this. It had gone through a background variation. One visitor to the studio has it that there's a temple in the background with a row of sphinxes carved in basalt, and it's a really complicated arrangement. So Alma Tadema really also, I think I used a quotation where he is writing a letter to somebody and famously says, "You have no idea how hard it is to paint a picture." And it's just like, it's such a simple phrase, but so relatable. But ultimately what Alma Tadema rests on is them meeting on the sea, kind of like these chess pawns on a chess piece in this game of war that Antony and Cleopatra are eventually playing. So Alma Tadema is really one of the great composers, I would say, of all time, but especially in the 19th century, without a doubt. And so this was another painting by his that I was discussing in the composition lecture. And this is unfortunately in a private collection, so we can't see it anywhere at the moment. But this is the Roses of Heliogabalus, and I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. And this is really a scene of really kind of, I was mentioning that this is actually really a gruesome scene painted in a beautiful way. So the emperor, which is the individual that you see at the very top left in the golden robe, and he's observing these people that are his party, that he's unleashing this cascade of rose petals. But as the account goes, the petals kept coming and coming and coming, and eventually he smothers his guests to death under these rose petals. And he does a wonderful job composing this, which we talked about in that lecture. But we also talked about how this was not the original incarnation of Alma Tadema's idea. His conception was originally to put the emperor and his party behind a canopy of a darker cloth with keyholes of space. I don't know if you can make that on the very far left, where you can see the indication of a sky, a temple. So that is also a very Dutch motif, where I think I was talking about that as well, where to reference, in a way, it's a sneaky way of referencing the outside without getting into the mess of perspective. So you reference the outside in a door or a window. So my eye references the outside world. It opens up your space, your layers of space, but you're not having to figure out the complex arrangement of angles and stuff like that. In this arrangement, Alma Tadema also features a large urn, silver urn in the center, which he ultimately decides against. But you can see the level of investment he's pouring into this study. So this is well beyond, this is going to sound really reprimanding to some of my students from like, like toughen up, Buttercup, but I'm really not, I don't really mean it that way. But what I'm saying is that the extent is really that that he's going to really kind of conjure the image from his subconscious is really to make every dress rehearsal count and to almost imagine as if you're playing to a full audience at all times. So these Alma Tadema really does go through great lengths to, in all of his work, he actually is named an expert in archaeological, I believe in Greek, Roman, or Egyptian artifacts because of he was so well immersed and in his history paintings, all of his tools, all of the props that he used, he would visit museums, ruthlessly sketch, do research, and so everything he tried to make as accurate as possible, which is a little unique, whereas some other painters in this time period are a little bit more subscribing to what was called Orientalism, where it's a little bit more of an amalgamation of traditions from Africa and Asia to create an optical, pleasant presentation. To Western eyes, it doesn't seem very questionable, but to those who know the cultures, you can quite tell that it is an amalgamation of things. So there's not really a concern for rendering culture accurately, let's say. So here, Alma Tadema is extremely conscious of this and really goes to such great lengths even that these rose petals, actually he has shipped in weekly because he's painting this painting over the course of winter. So this is over, I think he paints this within the course of 5 months. And it is over the course of winter when roses are not in season where he lives. So every weekend he would go to the train station and wait for his big cart of fresh roses from the French Riviera. And so he would paint them religiously to a point where his students recount him talking, having a full discussion, pipe in one hand, brush in the other, and painting the rose petals and being able to kind of multitask that way. But we also have seen cartoons, studies, and preparatory work in movements that we've seen prior. So here we remember seeing Titian, although here in this process, this would be called the pentimenti or pentimento, as some people online were saying. And then here, ultimately, you see this beautiful Titian on the left-hand side of Saint Sebastian. Now, one of the things that made Titian, just to revisit this briefly before continuing, what made Titian such a radical painter is that even though he would do these studies and prep work, he would still be a free-forming painter. Up until this point, making a painting was almost as similar as almost like a cabinet maker. There was a certain kind of repetitive efficiency of execution to creating images. And so you would fully flesh out your cartoon, transfer, basically essentially creating your own coloring book and then coloring it in, but with oil paint. And Titian changes things up where he goes directly to canvas, not all the time, but does go directly to canvas with brush in hand as opposed to having a fully fledged cartoon, and will make adjustments on the fly. So even though he's done all of this prep work and takes that in with him to the painting, he still makes adjustments as his intuition sees fit. So we've also seen this in other movements, and we've also seen other uses for this. So this is an Ankh painting of the Sphinx, and you can also see, it might be a little hard to make out that there's the grid system also applied over the cartoon. I would have to do a little bit of research to see if the cartoon and the painting are exactly the same size, but if the cartoon were smaller, that would be one of the ways Ankh would have actually enlarged the image without having the, the use of going to, FedEx or something to like print out a larger issue. But one of the interesting things about this is that this painting is dated to be started in 1808 and is completed in 1827. So this takes him quite a long time to complete. This is actually a student work that he resurrects later in his lifetime, and it also goes to demonstrate how in the academic process that the cartoon or the drawing is paramount. There are really no changes from cartoon to painting. There might be some subtle adjustments here and there, but again, overall, the cartoon or the drawing is also a preparatory or a study. Here, it has a high implementation where we're actually using it as the scaffolding to build the structure of the painting on, but it still qualifies as a study.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would the amount of time he spent on that one be
Yes.
normal to his practice, or was he doing other work like quicker in the time in that time?
So the question is, would this cartoon be up to the caliber of his normal practice, or would he be a little bit? Oh, to finish that. So this is not normal for him for this time frame to finish a piece. Although Ang is a little funny that way, so he can work very quickly when he wants to. He seems to be a little picky this way. It's like if the muses don't strike him, he's like, "Well, I don't wanna." So he so I mean, I mean, I kid. He's amazing. But like for instance, he takes 12 years to paint a portrait of. I'm forgetting her name. Basically, it's funny because the original design had this woman and her child, but by the time he returns it, she's practically an adult, so he had to crop her out. And then he decides to change her dress, and then her husband eventually says, "Listen, this has been going on over a decade. You either give me this painting or you destroy it. It's one of the two. I've paid you and all this stuff." So then he whips up a completely different painting in 6 months and sends that instead, and that satisfies the contract, and then still tinkers away at this painting for another few years before finishing it. So, but on the other hand, Ang is also famous for doing these beautiful, immaculate little pencil portraits where the heads are about the size of a quarter. And so after Napoleon and Europeans are doing the grand tour again through Europe, for the aristocrats, Ang is a must stop. And so again, here he works very quickly, and it's really annoying because if you go to the MFA, you can actually see these in person, and they are just immaculately rendered. And again, they're incredibly small, and many of them are British clientele. But what's really amazing about this is apparently you would come and sit for Ang in the early afternoon for 2 hours. You would then go home, and the next day you would come in and pick up your portrait finished and completed after sitting for I'm sure if you had more people in your party, it would take longer. So you could see he could have a very fast turnover rate, but then he can also pluck away at something without really a good reason why. Like when you look, you're kind of like, huh, interesting, okay, So, but I thought that was really interesting about this painting. It's like he found this. Oh, I meant to do something with this in my student years. Now let me see what I can do now at this stage in my life. So now, I'm not talking about him long, don't worry. So this, of course, is Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and I do remember reading that this painting actually has a record for the most preparatory sketches or preparatory works of any other painting in art history. I believe, and this is where I think it's almost like something like 500 to 800 kind of preparatory works for this. Now, I know this is not everyone's taste. This is a real radical development in figurative art. But he does do like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gouaches, sketches, oil paintings, etching, you name it, every medium he has explored to really flush out this idea. And this is partially a little bit of a modern concept of how the study becomes an extension of the art form itself rather than something that pre-exists the art form entirely. So Picasso here is kind of searching through his kind of creative fog and trying to draw out from this these kind of a sense of certainty. Ang also said that, and actually I think of Ang and Picasso as kind of somewhat of this. They're very different, I know, but they're also similar in some ways. Ang said that drawing is the honesty of art. It is the most primal form of all visual forms of art. Even the cave paintings, we call them paintings loosely. They do have sometimes more of a kinship to drawing. So sculptors, painters, and of course draftspeople all kind of do drawing. Or now you do it on your iPad if you call that drawing, but I know, shots fired, I know, really. And so here we have, by the way, I do think that's a skill set, do not come for me, okay? So like, and so here we have these two studies by John William Waterhouse, again, one of the great storytellers of the 19th century. This is Consulting the Oracle. So these are two different studies, again, on gouache and watercolor on the left here, and on the right, it's just a pen and ink sketch. What I love about this on the left is that this is some kind of like postcard or something, and if you turn your head this way, you'll see that that's an oracle sitting on top of this high stool. So she would be seated over the cracks in the floor to breathe in the fumes, giving her the visions of the future. And so he goes through this process again of fleshing out his thoughts. But these are, typically, as you can see from the two studies, minor adjustments, mainly having to do with the type of screening to put behind the cluster of women. And this is the fully finished painting. Again, a beautiful, an amazing painter. And again, if you note again that trick of anchoring, where that little square of blue sky that's at the tip of the oracle's fingers leads you outside of this inner circle to the outside, but cleverly and very conveniently hides the whole, like, one point having to draw, all those straight lines. However, he does give himself a challenge with this mosaic on the floor that is in a semicircle. Now, when you observe the painting, something else might become a little bit more familiar to you if you were with us for the compositional workshop, which are the circles themselves. They're kind of arms that bring you into the painting, and they refer to the outside world. So they both make us believe we're participating in the painting as well. So it's you're more of a participant in these. This, of course, is Jerome Gladiators. And here he's using the curve of the wall of the Colosseum, as well as the awnings above, to all create this kind of consuming sense of being inside the arena. So Waterhouse, again, fleshing out his thoughts. So here, this is a name that I practiced, and I really do apologize. This is Saint Eulia. Eulia. And so you can see here that Waterhouse has a lot, and you can, at least to me, I can see why he had thoughts about the gouache drawing on the right-hand side. It features this very large section of pillar, which would have had writing of significance to refer to the scene here of what's happening. This is a very romanticized idea, of course. The true legend of the saint, she would have been a burned corpse at this point. Her corpse was lit on fire, dragged through the streets, that sort of thing. So this is a very romanticized version. But of course, according to Catholic legend, the snow fell to cover her naked body for her modesty, and that's what Waterhouse is depicting here. So he forgoes this idea of this big blocking piece of structure, which really actually prevents you from optically kind of going around. You almost feel like you have to visually go around it, and instead goes for the cross that she was crucified on, with an audience at the very far back, but he does bring them closer. So again, searching through his different thoughts, but painting is application, not theory, and so you do need to make your thoughts manifest, and that is why studies are kind of almost like the fingers to the palm, the painting being the palm of the hand. They are kind of an extension of it that help you arrive at these conclusions. They also help you to find and illuminate difficulties where you don't have to actually fall into some pitfalls. Yes?
Is that in the finished piece, right-hand side, where you got rid of the large statue plinth? Is that a dove above the?
Yes. So these are doves.
Feel like the representation of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. So doves usually have strong connotations with the Holy Spirit in Catholicism. Also, this idea of war and peace. So here we have the Roman warrior. So there's a little bit of that kind of as well. And if you think back to the composition lecture, this idea of mirror imaging. If you look at the doves, they're both bookends of each other facing on either side of the saint, kind of focusing your attention in there a little bit. So when we also saw this painting of the Darlings of Emperor Ignatius, I believe. And so this, you can see, again, this was actually an unfinished work, but this is where sometimes when you're researching, you're not sure if the curators don't really understand or if it is what it seems to be. So sometimes this is referred to as an unfinished painting, and sometimes it's referred to as a study. To me, it seems very far developed. If we look at the emperor on the left, it does seem like there's a good amount of time investment, and it does seem like he understands where he's going on the right-hand side. So it does seem like there is a conviction problem here, where he doesn't really like the direction he's going in. When we look at the ending painting, well, actually, let me go back. Actually, no, let's go ahead. So when we look at the ending painting, you can kind of see why he made the changes that he did. So to kind of repeat the narrative of what's being depicted here, Rome is falling, and the emperor is being told that Rome is falling. Rome is also one of the name of his favorite chickens, and so he freaks out thinking one of his chickens is and so he's thought of as the last and the most pathetic emperor. And so if you look at this here, he does try to isolate the emperor with his chickens in this in in this L-shaped format to kind of separate them from the crowd. But if you look at the diagonal of the stairs and the perspective, he's not really maximizing the diagonal of the entire picture plane. And that recalled back to this painting, which demonstrates the full range of how you can take from one corner to the other of a painting via the table and maximize its dimensional quality. And so this is Tintoretto, by the way, The Last Supper. And so here you can again see just drawing these lines to show you how that diagonal is utilized. So you can see here he's rotated that diagonal to create a deeper space. So we go back further. It creates a greater sense of tension and isolation. The emperor's head is now down and is more thoughtful. So shadows are always thought of as having a sense of weightiness to them, both physically, as you've heard me say in your critiques, cast shadows anchor objects to a grounding plane. But shadows are also thought of as the realm of the unconscious. And so when people are pictured in shadow, it's to convey a sense of they're in thought, they're a person of thought, or they're lost in thought. And so this person's lost, but in idiocy, essentially. Again, relatable. I don't always keep it real. I know. But again, I would like to point out that if you go back to the painting, again, maximizing the diagonal, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, again, we have the anchor, these two doves that are opening, the dove split in half, an allusion to the piece that is about to be split apart with the Rome falling. And we can see the men rushing in to alert that a mob has arrived. So again, a keyhole to evoke a sense of distance, but without the obligations of explaining yourself. It's kind of great. And he bookends that with the pigeons on the throne that are the closest to us, that are totally undisturbed, or doves, excuse me, that are totally undisturbed, just as the emperor is, and they're kind of in this own world. So he changes the composition to, I think, help convey that sense of isolation and how this square part of the painting is almost, it's literally he's in his own world, essentially. So this is Lord Leighton, and this is Flaming June. This is painted in 1895. And so you can see on the right-hand side, this is actually very reminiscent of some of the studies that I showed you earlier of the work that students do here, where this is very reminiscent of swatches of color that convey the large pictorial effect. You can see that there are a few changes, but not many. So like, for example, the parapet above. So if you look at the very top of the painting, there is this, what appears to be a border. And when I was looking at this, originally I thought that was part of the frame that it was in, and I cropped it out. And then I realized that it is actually part of the painting. It's meant to be a fabric that the sunlight is coming through. And originally he had a very curvilinear, it almost looks like melting something like liquid almost on the right-hand side. But for whatever reason, he decides against it. I think that the zigzag pattern kind of contrasted the calm horizontals that he was trying to convey, giving a sense of rest to the overall painting. Now, even this on the right-hand side, this is not a once and done thing. This is not something that was done in a weekend. So this is after he's wrestled through different positions and having the model try on different outfits, first in the nude. Actually very traditional in how Greek sculptures would have been made, so that the figure was sculpted first and then the drapery sculpted over the figure. The figure is always paramount in Western art. And then, of course, after the matter of the gesture and the figure had been decided, he then, of course, had to search for the portrait. And you can see, what I love about this on the right, you can kind of see at the very bottom, he's like, I think I got it. Like, because that's her pose at the very bottom here. And this actually has a very close resemblance to the finished portrait of the woman as well. So this, yeah, sure. So this is Ernest Meissonier, and champion of the Best Beard in History Award. So if you have been here physically at the Academy of Realist Art in Boston, and you've been to the second floor bathroom, you'll notice that there's a clipping from a 19th century newspaper showing current painters of the time, and Meissonier is right at the top of the list. So if he looks familiar, that's where you're seeing him. Meissonier is also A little bit of a maybe a step up, arguably, or at least Alma-Tadema's equal in obsession of getting things right. And he really does go through great pains. And he has quite a bit of range. So these are incredibly small works that are actually at the Clark that I saw recently. This portrait on the right-hand side is probably, if memory serves, I would say that it's probably about 6 inches high and like about 4 inches across, a very tiny portrait with immaculate lace work. I mean, it's really an incredible tour de force. Unfortunately, my camera did not pick up the sense of atmosphere that is captured here. What I love about this painting on the left is that he takes you to this white silk stocking that's on his foot is beautifully rendered, and that's the brightest thing in the painting, and everything else gets darker as you go back, leading you to the tapestry in the back, which is like washily painted. That was like his first layer. He also does enormous battle scenes, and as you can see, really kind of I sometimes call him the Michael Bay history painter, because it's just like it is just like explosions everywhere and a lot of, and I mean that in a I mean that in a good way, even though I don't really like Michael Bay, but anyway. But there's a bravura, to say the least. There is really a large ambition behind some of these paintings here, and also a great landscape artist as well. I do have to say, sometimes that he's not given enough credit. He does wonderful clouds, and he also is. He's very much immersed into the military and understanding the different types of military garb and wear, and he's very conscious. And like Alma Tadema with history, Messonnier is really ruthless in his scrutiny about the type of uniform that the men are wearing. But he also does a great job while depicting these large theatrical works, which really kind of are cinematic in scope and scale. He also takes the same characters and is able to make kind of a domestic, kind of almost a Dutch scene, really. This background looks like it's out of a Vermeer, really. And what I love about this is, again, I'm a bit of a sucker for the center here, where you have this artist who's sketching the soldier and the dog who's looking up at the soldier, who must belong to the soldier, looking up at his owner at the same time. I love the soldier curiously leaning in and looking at the artist over the artist's shoulder as he's drawing. So it is kind of a very informal, kind of a almost Norman Rockwellian kind of a painting. So this painting, I really I love this painting. So this one is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and this is Friedland, painted in 1807. This was part of what was going to be a series of 5 paintings depicting the 5 key events of Emperor Napoleon's life. Messonnier loved Napoleon. He only completes 2 of those paintings, and this is one of them. So, and when it was first shown, one of the things that was really commented on was the grass in the foreground and how it seemed like every blade of grass was painted. Messonnier, when he goes through extreme lengths, he actually arranges horse wranglers to bring their horses in to trample his property to get the feeling of a war-trodden land. He has, I believe, a set of train tracks on his property, so he can actually have a moving studio set and to paint various views along the trajectory. And this painting is an enormous success. It's not enormously big, even though it does look like it is. I mean, it's large, but it's not the biggest painting in the world, is what I'm saying. This painting sold for $60,000 at the time. By today's standards, that's $1.5 million. And this painting was sold basically for the amount of money to buy a chateau, basically, at that time. So Messonnier's second painting for the 5 key moments in Emperor Napoleon's life. Oh, wait, no, I wanted to talk about his studies. So not only does he, but he also has, like I said, horse wranglers come in and on this, and does a ton of different studies of horses. This kind of reminds me a little bit of Leonardo's horse studies, if you're familiar at all with those. But he's really, and they're actually quite beautiful. He gives Degas a run for his money in terms of contour and line. So these are all small oil on panel. And so technically speaking, if you look at the horse's chest on the right-hand side, you can see the brushwork to demarcate using straight lines, mind you, on the left side there. To demarcate where the chest is, and is really being very alla prima about this because it is a study after all. So approached very much like how you would do a color study, but with a little bit more, accuracy and TLC. So in these figures, again, very considerate and careful planning of what uniforms which officers and which scene is wearing. So very much like a director's length kind of. He reminds me a little bit of Stanley Kubrick in that sense, who notoriously would have people made Shelley Duvall break because he had her do like 100 and some odd takes of a scene. So he was really just ruthless in his scrutiny of the detail. So the Met also has these. This is one of his surviving models that he would have used also to position and actually light and actually paint from. This is composed of wood, wax, sometimes leather. He would dip, so for capes, he would dip the fabric into glue or wax and then hang them with the wind to kind of get the feeling of it moving, and then attach them to get a sense of motion. Yeah.
He made all of these.
I believe he yes, I'm gonna say he did. I'm pretty yeah, because I mean, because it's gonna be something that what you want, and I'm gonna so I'm pretty sure he made these. So they would be of varying different sizes and positions, and they're mobile too. So like he like is making his own toys to play with to get everything just right. It's not that big either. It's like they're mainly about this big. So this is the second painting of In the Five by Messonnier. And what I love about this is apparently so Messonnier, to get the look of snow, dumped flour over his models and over the dirt to make it feel like there was freshly fallen snow. That kind of makes me want to do a snow scene just to do that, because that sounds so um what's that? Yeah, gluten-free, yes, exactly. So you can see also doing preparatory work of a model on the left-hand side, most likely sitting on the horse. And it was said like he would go up and put flour on the model's shoulders and stuff to make it feel like it was actively falling. So this real kind of like almost like B horror movie kind of like special effects, which is kind of, it's really like he's really pushing what he can do, everything he can get to have like the best special effects of the time, really. But this also is reminiscent of someone we talked about before, which is Poussin. Nikolai Poussin also made wax figures, but in a little bit more controlled manner. He would actually make numerous little wax figures that he would carefully proportion and make sure were, very, very much in the ideal fashion. He was a classicist through and through. That's the one thing about Poussin, is that most people find him a little off-putting because he seems very erudite and very kind of austere. But and I think that yes, that's true, but there's more to it than that. But anyway, so he would carefully place these in a setting with a grid on the floor to help understand the perspective if it were to go back in space. And again, dipping small pieces of fabric in wax or in a glue and letting that dry by air to position the fabric. And sometimes a painted background, obviously, for the actors to give something for them to perform against. And as you saw in this image, they would be placed in a box with careful lighting. So he would be very careful so he could calibrate where the fall of light happened and could make sure that the light was getting where it should be to direct your view. So going to another extent, so Poussin kind of again one-ups Messonnier a little bit. So this painting, The Adoration of Venus by Titian, Poussin, it takes him 3 attempts to get to Rome because it's just such a difficult journey at this point in time. And when he makes it, he is really an obsessive. He is going to places of antiquity, spending countless hours in front of them. In those days, you most likely could have touched them as well, and is recording measurements and coming up with classical formulas. He is really becoming quite obsessive about the classical canon, to a point where he does a copy of this painting, but doesn't just do a copy. He sculpts all these little putti and all these little cherubs and places these little models and actually creates the models and actually uses that as well as the painting. So this kind of, again, this obsession of trying to get this. I'm not sure why, because you're copying the painting, but in any case, he's that level of dedication to his craft, even to the point where he's taking direct quotations from antiquity and putting them into his actual paintings as well, because he's spending so much time with them. They either have seeped into his unconscious or he's literally, well, not double clicking and pasting, but there are definitely strong influences. So these are the Borghese dancers, which was a very well-known artifact at the time. It is of an enormously well-preserved sculpture, and you can see that they're found here in Poussin's the Dance of Time, I believe is what this is called. I'm a little rusty on the myth of this. I believe that they represent the 4 different stages of like wealth, poverty, hard work, and kind of an endless. It's so the baby's blowing bubbles, which are a metaphor for the fleeting nature of life. A bubble that gets it's all loaded with portents of mortality and things like that. But you can really clearly see that the relationship in gesture and even in drapery choice. So this is the Gaeta vase from Italy, and again, this is also something that he had spent an enormous amount of time on, observing, doing multiple sketches of. And in his early work, he does a painting of Bacchus and Ariadne, which we saw by Titian not too long ago. And his rendition features two figures where if you look at the woman on the right and if you look at the man circled on the left, seem very similar to the two figures that we see here on the Gaeta vase. Apparently this vase is quite large, and apparently when it was first found, it was used as a, forgetting the term for where you baptize babies.
Baby sink.
Yeah, yes. So it was basically, I think it was used as that initially. It'd be kind of a cool flex to be like, well, I was baptized. And
Baptismal font or
no.
What would it have, if it was so large, what would they have used it?
That is actually a good question. I'm not actually sure what the function of the object was. Probably wine. Yeah. So that, put a pin in that. That comes up again. Don't, yeah. So yes. What does it say about me? I perk up when someone says wine. Anyway. So, and again, if we look at another side of the vase here, this man helping. So this, of course, in tradition, kind of when being drunk had to do with being accessing the unconscious. So it wasn't just all about kind of like, you know, the joke of being drunk. It really was like you would access to your more primal, true kind of universal self, because you're no longer bound by the shackles of nature or reason. So, but these two figures find their counterpart here in the Adoration of Pan. So going through such a lengthy means to try to evoke this kind of classical feeling to his work, like going to Italy studying, which was obviously very common, but going to the lengths that he did of just kind of measuring antiquity and really measuring up. Now, the one painting I really wanted to focus on, because I felt like this really does, I think, paint a very clear picture, no pun intended, about what studies do. This is Theodore Géricault. This is a self-portrait, and he paints the raft of the Medusa, which is an incredibly large work, incredibly important work. It's really beautiful. I saw, for years I was under the impression I saw the real thing, and then a real ego deflator is I saw a life-size reproduction at the Metropolitan, and it was part of a traveling show. So I had to like unscratch off one of the paintings of the bucket list, like because I thought I'd seen it, but it was true to size, and it is enormous. So this to give you a sense of scale, the painting measures 23 feet by 16 feet. So that's an enormous canvas. And so you can see the figures are pretty much about life size. They really dominate the picture plane here. And this all recounts the story of what took place in June of 1816, where the Medusa, the ship seen here, is part of a convoy after the fall of Napoleon and the transfer of peace, is taking, at that time, Senegal back from the British to a French colony. The captain, appointed by the king, is a very inexperienced navigator, and due to his inexperience, he overtakes the group and finds himself 100 miles off course, where they run aground on a sandbar just off the west coast of Africa. Until the Argus, this is the sister ship, but until the Argus picks them up 13 days later. After it had been beach wrecked by the sandbar, it was not really taking on water at that point. And there were 400 people on board. The lifeboats only had enough room for 250 people. So there would be 146 to 150 people that would not have a lifeboat. So under the captain's orders, the carpenter puts together a raft during their stay over the next couple days. The raft measured 60 feet by 20 feet. It was going to have to accommodate 150 people. So people were watching this being constructed next to the ship, and they hated the look of this, as you might imagine, and they called it the machine, is what it was called. The original plan was that the ships that were ahead were going to tow the raft and with them to safety. But after just a few miles, they realized that the raft is dragging the boats, and so they sever the ties and abandon the 150 people on the raft. Now, the people that are in the boats are, of course, the politicians and the soldiers, and those who were left on the raft were former Napoleonic allies and kind of the we'll call them like the lower class people to those of that age. Until again they're picked up by the Argus. This is a picture of what the machine looked like. Well, the machine or the raft. So again, this is 60 by 20 feet, and this is what would have had to have accommodated 150 people. They were given also provisions. They were given a bag of biscuits, 2 barrels of water, and 6 barrels of wine. So there's the wine for 150 people.
One bag of
The funny, so the funny thing is that they do need to make the raft lighter. So they push off the 2 barrels of water. And it's like not the wine, anything but the wine.
anything.
And the bag of biscuits, I think, lasted, I think they said that they had eaten by this first or second day. So 150 people go set voyage on the raft. And by the time the Argus picks up the survivors, 15 make it at the end of the journey. There's a very extensive tale of murder, cannibalism, and a lot of atrocities that take place on the boat. Jericho is really obsessed with this idea. He interviews the survivors. He talks to the engineer. He talks to the surgeon. They actually make appearances in the actual painting. And at first, he's really not sure of what part of this epic to depict. Do I depict the moment of mutiny, where there's actually a mutiny on the raft at one point? Do I depict the moment where they cut the ties and the boats are drifting away? Do I depict the moment, so he's going through these, and here you can see large sketches in the middle, but you can see individual figures. So he's thinking both larger scale and smaller scale, but just nothing more than simple curvilinear lines to suggest figures. He then starts to cast his mind to the landscape and actually does go plein air painting. Actually, he's a terribly unwell man physically. He's rather sick a lot of the time, and so here he is powering through fevers, working on the landscape, trying to get a sense of doom and gloom really. The survivors are actually rescued on a clear, bright morning with calm waters, but Jericho does not picture them that way. He actually creates a much more stormy event. It was actually a much more calm affair, if you will. And then he does start to do more and more intense studies. So the canvas gets to a point, his idea gets to a point where it's so large that he has to actually rent a studio, and he rents one across the street from a hospital, where he does go to gather body parts to collect, to bring back to his studio so that he can study very carefully the colors and the nature of a decomposing corpse. And so he keeps this head of I think it was referred to as the head of a madman or an asylum patient that he kept for 2 or 3 days, apparently. So he does do a few different sketches. I do have to say they're beautiful sketches, though. I do understand that they're very morbid subject matter, but from a technical point of view, they are really beautifully done. So here he is making a still life of the severed pieces here, and so here's the drawn head, but now painted. So you can see here though that these are practically fully fledged paintings. Like if you were to say that these are like, I mean, you could call that a still life, I understand, but these are not just the remedial small affairs that are really a brief encounter. These are really immersive and a deep, thorough understanding of every aspect. He's not going to paint this head in there directly, but he wants to understand it intimately so he can figure out how to take what is the most poetically valuable aspect and technical and apply that. So for example, how the flesh is a dark green, but where the zygomatic is coming through the skin, it's a warm, pale yellow because of the bone being more visible. And here again. as time goes on and through his, his dozens and dozens and dozens of studies, he does start to hone in on a cast of characters of the raft. And one of them is a father, what's been referred to as a father and son. And this is the father figure of that pair. And so you can see certain references here. This is a very classical figure here in terms of like the big kind of eyes, the curly linear hair, the musculature, everything here really. So he is being Jericho here is being very much a true figurative painter of the time, where he is looking at classical ideals and bringing them up to speed. So using pen and ink and wash. And this duo of a father and son, kind of facing kind of an apocalyptic sense, recalls Dante's tale of Count Ugolino, here shown by Carpeaux. This is an amazing sculpture that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And so this really, I mean, it's a sculpture, so you really have to see it in the round, but it is really just incredible. Essentially, the short version of the tale is that Count Ugolino is left in a tower with his sons to die of starvation. And I think the line goes, when the last son died, Ugolino mourned, and then grief was less strong than hunger. And so Ugolino is faced with the prospect of, do I eat my children who have died to live, or do I die the same death they have? So it's a very similar tone to what Jericho is actually depicting. And so this really does start to convey, the images here start to convey that. But if you look at the man again, it is very indicative of the central man here. This is David's painting of the Oath of the Horatii. This is a very similar size to the Raft of the Medusa, and this is what that size is typical for. This is appropriate for big history paintings or biblical. But you can see the difference in presentation. This is elegantly pressed. This is tasteful. This is by those standards. He's presenting a very contemporary tragedy in a historical format, and that is a completely radical thing for the time. So he does have some references to classical antiquity, like I've said before. So one of the main figures, which actually is one of the more bold moves that Jericho makes, is that he makes the central figure that is waving the Argus down as a black man, because this is a very critical piece of the government at the time. And this transfer of power, quote unquote, he's trying to make no mistake, it was entrenched in the slave trade. So Jericho himself is an abolitionist and is very much against the slave trade at this time. And so he's very much campaigning against the abolishment of the slave trade. So here we can see references to the Belvedere torso. So in here we see that on the right-hand side. The Belvedere torso, of course, is very familiar to a lot of you. Some of you have had the pleasure of doing one of these two views of the Belvedere torso from the front and the back. You can also see recalls to Michelangelo. So the posing of the male figure in this kind of graceful, but in this instance, not a graceful kind of expectation of creation, but in a agony of waiting and isolation. So he does start to wind down a little bit and narrow in on exactly what he wants to focus on, and that is the moment when the Argus is being hailed. So the way that the rescue happened is that they did see a ship, the Argus, and waved. The Argus then passes them and then turns around and comes back and picks them up 2 hours later. And one of the survivors said that they've never experienced such a wide range of euphoric hope and then dashing. And I can't imagine what that experience must have been like. And so here, this is a very far along, and this would be like kind of somewhat of a landing of the plane study, where he has a very thorough cartoon in charcoal that he has drawn and fixed and is now painting on top of, and has really worked out a lot of the compositional concerns through the studies that he has done. So this is a close-up just to give you a better sense of how the surface treatment is, where you can see, again, the grid, and you can see that there is a simple ink wash to kind of cement the drawing that was transferred. And then finally, he does start to do kind of fully immersed, like fully fledged, basically mini versions of the actual painting itself. So these are almost like a full-on dress rehearsal that he is really putting himself through. He's still figuring things out, though. The main body of people that we see in the center ultimately don't look like this, but the figure on the left, some things do make it through to the end. So he does go through, as I said, he rented a studio space, And he also creates an exact replica of the machine or the raft itself. So he actually, in his studio, would have had this constructed raft that he would be positioning models on to be, again, as accurate as possible. So, but through the studies, we start to get a cast of characters. These are actually some of the real survivors. So these are actually kind of like, you know, when they make a movie about a real life event and the real person has like the cameo that's like, hi, thanks, and like kind of leaves. So that does happen here. So these are a few that I'll be naming them in just a little bit. But again, beautiful little pencil drawings. And these, again, would have not only served as a means of exploration and illumination through drawing, but he would have used these as models as well, as references for when models would not be as readily available. He also, as I said earlier, he is an abolitionist, and he does employ this. This is Joe. Sorry, this is Joseph. Joseph is Haitian and is the model that is featured of the man at the Belvedere torso that I just showed. So he's featured at least twice in the raft, in the painting itself, and is actually a model that was employed. So Joseph is the man who we just saw a portrait of, is the man flagging the Argus on the right-hand side. He's also the man's head we see in relief against the sky. Now, Alexandre Corard, on the engineer, that if you look at the man who's gesturing towards Joseph, if I go back a few studies, you'll see that the second head to the right is a head study of Alexander. If we go back here, Henry on the left here, that is the surgeon. And the surgeon, you can see on the very far right, the pensive man in profile. It's a little hard to see here. And then, of course, you have, well, Levelette. That is the ship's carpenter, the man that you can see in profile with his hair blowing in the wind. Now, the reason that this is partially very difficult to see is a bit of a medium problem. A lot of what pigment called bitumen has been used in the making of this image, and bitumen is a very fugitive. So bitumen, for those of you who might not be hearing me correctly, bitumen, and basically it's a tar-like substance that really does not have a very. You basically should not be using it to paint with, but he did use a lot of this. So unfortunately, the side effect or the aging of bitumen is that it basically blackens over time. So the image is getting harder and harder to see as time passes, which is why it would be a little hard to fake it, to kind of like take it off and put a replica in its place without anybody knowing, to repair it, not for like a heist or anything. But like it would be a little hard to do that because that surface is, it's kind of known to not be perfect, so it would be hard to replicate that level of imperfection, I think. And so we do have another tie-in. This is Delacroix. This is Delacroix actually makes a cameo in this painting. He actually is he's actually one of the models for Géricault. This man with his head down and arm outstretched, that's him. So kind of a little bit of a bummer. I mean, if you were telling your friends like you were in a movie and you're like, I'm that guy, it's like, sure, Fred. Sure, Fred. But apparently he was so enwrapped by what he saw, he said that Géricault allowed him to see the raft before it was finished. And he was just so overwhelmed that he kind of in a tizzy just was doing laps when he left the studio and then just until he was tired out and got back to his own flat or his own room. But he does model, and I think it's also rumored that he does model for a few other figures, but that one we do know is him. So this young man is Jamar, and Jamar is Géricault's live-in assistant. He's 18 years old. Yes, do you have a question?
Oh, well, just sorry to move on from that, but it seems like it was a very big production. I wonder if at the time, since they maybe didn't have like movies and whatnot, would people have anticipated the release of that painting?
Yes. So this was unveiled in the Salon of 1819, and it was a little bit like, you could think of a salon as a little bit like what by today's standards might be considered a movie premiere. So there was no like social media, so nobody knew what anybody else was really working on except through word of mouth. So you kind of was a big surprise. Nobody kind of knew what the others were submitting completely. But this is Jamar, and he's his 18-year-old kind of live-in assistant, and he really helps Géricault paint this. mainly in the sense that he's really there for support. They have fights repeatedly. He walks out, and like, you know, Jericho has to go chase him after a couple of days and like, please come back. You know, you mean a lot. But it's not a romantic partnership, but they do really kind of depend on each other. He also so Jericho works monkishly on this painting. After doing all of this research, he has a large blank canvas with a grid on it, does the outlines of the figures, and goes from that to practically finished, and is very direct and immediate about it. But that's due to the fact that he had gathered all of that cumulative knowledge through the searching of studies. Doing a painting, I always use it's like shooting an arrow to a target, and each study you do is like you're drawing the arrow back more and more. So the hope is that when you release it, you've motivated your choices well enough through information that you hit that target. And Jamar models also for a couple of figures, this being one of them, the main figure that is shown tipping over and slipping into the sea on the right-hand side. Beautiful figure drawing, and it's like beautiful, and also it shows how beautiful line can be. So it's not like, you know, filled in tone, like it's just that it's hatch mark and structure, just beautiful. So this is it actually in the 1819 Salon. This is painted by, I wrote this guy's down. I always want to make sure to give people credit. Oh shoot, where is his name? Oh no, I wrote it down because I was gonna, and I just taught it. Oh well, anyway, I'll get back to that. Anyway, so if you're, so you can see it pretty much in the center there, this large paint, that is the raft of the Medusa there. So apparently the king did see this, and being completely oblivious that this was a critique on him, being, again, he appointed the captain that got them in this mess in the first place, simply said, oh, well, your painting is certainly no disaster. Like, you know, kind of just like some kind of compliment. So very ignorant of kind of just, or maybe just was purposefully stepping over that. But so when it came to the reception of it, it was somewhat mixed. It was a very political picture, and so as you can imagine, if a political painting came out today, the reaction would probably be among divided lines. If you were on one side, you liked it. If you were on the other side, you didn't. So that was very much the reception, and it was contrasted with this painting, which was also exhibited in the same salon, and actually was thought to exhibit the purest levels of beauty and ideal kind of classical form. And it's a bit too idealized. Now there is one there's one kind of comparison. There's actually a barg with a set of legs, and I believe her legs are either the model for that, or there's some kind of relationship there. But I meant to do that, but I forgot. But this reminded me a little bit of another instance where a painting that had to do with a critique on a government in reference to slavery, which is Turner's The Slave Ship, which is actually here at the MFA. And Turner's The Slave Ship happens a few years later. So this is done decades later, and has to do with the tale of the Zong. And this is a really awful event in which captain of the vessel throws over slaves to claim them as losses at sea for insurance purposes, and into the shark-infested waters of the Caribbean. And it eventually kind of starts the process of stopping the slave trade. But it is really familiar in a sense. And interestingly enough, I came across this, and I was like, I read the description of it and I didn't really believe it. And then I looked it up and I was like, well, I'll be. So just like how this was the course was perfect in taste and refinement and execution for the salon that the raft of the Medusa was exhibited. This really was received badly and was referred to as the contents of a spittoon, and it was just, they really tore it apart. It also had a very lengthy title, and they made fun of that by doing a sketch of it in the newspaper with like a paragraph or a title. Like, they really tore poor Turner apart. So this was the painting. So this was the painting that year that the critics thought was perfect.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yes.
What year?
So this is, I know, really. So this is Edward Landseer, and this is 1818, I believe. So and so it shows, yes. So it shows a learned judge. It shows the judge as a poodle, and he's holding court, and it's a very, I mean, it's like, I really feel so mixed about it, right? It's just like, it's like, without a doubt, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, masterpiece of 19th century British landscape painting. But I mean, I'm not mad at it. It is. It is. But uh, yeah. But anyway, but I hope that gives you an idea about like how studies are a part of your actual painting, and not just and actually that it can actually help to illuminate where there's difficulty and help you to actually create a better overall better piece. Sorry, just that. But if you guys will indulge me, I just wanted to pull up one or two paintings that do feature. Okay, so this is a portrait, a self-portrait by Mary Denise Villers, and this is actually at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. And so my father was a New York stockbroker for years, and so when he would go to work, he would sometimes take me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I remember loving this painting ever since I was a kid, because the sense of light is just incredible in person. This photo doesn't really do it justice. So Marie is looking at us in a mirror, and the light is pouring over her shoulder, hitting the paper and bouncing back, and it's creating this beautiful glowing light effect. I have a little gripe with my instructor Fernando about this, because Fernando hates this painting. Like I walked in with him at the Met, and he looked at it and he just like was like, I'm moving on. And I asked him, I was like, well, why? He goes, the values on the face aren't, like, he starts listing off the technical problems that he saw about it. And that's actually not too far away from what actually happened with the painting. So the painting actually was first seen was attributed, and it was being attributed to David at the time. And as you can see, it's a really beautiful image, and so it was misinterpreted, and people were real in admiration for it. But when the correction came that it was by a woman and that it was by Marie Denise Villers, that's when criticism started to arise about the painting, about how the drawing in some sections are not quite right, how the light effect might not be quite right. That is where there's kind of this division. But Mary Denise is really kind of, it's a really complicated image, and I think it really does show, I think, actually right on theme with what we're talking about tonight, the obsession that one has in one's craft. So she's not like the other women her age, like that are in the back, they're mooning with their lovers in the background there through a cracked glass. She's concentrating on depicting herself in paint. So she's having this relationship with paint as opposed to someone else, which is also a relationship, of course, with herself at the same time. So, and it's also huge. This painting is very large. I would say that she's probably just under life size, but the fabric of the skirt, oh, I mean, I've dressed, it's really amazing. I think it also maybe suffers a little bit, the fact that it very much has a bit of a Jane Eyre kind of feel to it. I could see it suffering from a sense of commercialism, but it is really a beautiful painting. The other painting in the Met that I wanted to discuss, and most of you probably know which one I'm going to be pulling up. So this is The Horse Fair by Rosa Bonheur. And this painting again is absolutely immense. It's enormous, but it is really an enormous painting. And when you first look at it, your eye goes right to the white horse on the right hand side there, and just the sense of dimension. She actually had to get permission to dress as a man when she went out to go paint, because she said if she was to paint, she could not do it in a dress and a bonnet and a girdle. So she had to actually get permission from the government to dress as a man. Yeah. So I believe actually when the French president came to visit Rosa Bonheur, he asked that she dress in her pants so he could see how a painter truly works. But she was very thorough. The background was criticized as not being a correct representation of the location that she was depicting. So she actually repainted the background, and she actually shows up in the painting, right in the middle. She's the only one who's making eye contact with us aside to the horse, but that's her looking out towards us right in the center. Yeah. I mean that horse, that horse could rule a nation. It is so good. So good. She really did. Animals were really kind of her first love. She really did. I think she had a pet lion at one point. Like she really did. There's actually a study at the Gardner of a goat. It's a great little goat painting that she did. But yeah, that would be a horse's ass I'd be proud to be, essentially.
redo that.
Yes.
Do you think she used like little sculptures?
Well, that I'm not so she did do a lot of on location work. So she actually would go out and observe animals and would actually draw from life quite a bit. I'm not sure if some like taxidermy was involved, but I'm not too sure if she had models for animals. I think that like the model that would be, I think, a harder ask because the anatomy of animals are so complicated from one to the next, and a horse really, I think its musculature is one of its most attractive features, and it's so they're probably mostly from life studies, I'm assuming, but I could be wrong.
All right.
So yeah, all right, fine.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. All right, you're welcome.